Good morning and good afternoon to all. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm Doug Morgan, Group CEO of Cordium, and on this webinar I'm very pleased to be joined by Virginie O'Shea, Research Director at Aite Group. Today we're delighted to be able to share with you the results of some research that was undertaken in a collaborative effort involving Cordium and Aite. At its core, I think this research is really focused on adaptation and specifically how the firms that we surveyed have reacted and are really continuing to react to changes in the regulatory landscape. The research that we'll speak to covers a range of topics from operational pain points to investment priorities and the use of technology, and I think it gives a valuable perspective on where our industry is heading. Our objective with today's session is to help promote a dialogue within our community on the issues and challenges involved in managing governance, risk, and compliance. Full disclosure, to add to this dialogue, we'll ask you to do a little work along the way and answer some questions that we put to the group. Not too much heavy lifting on your side, I assure you. We plan to leave some time available at the end of the session for questions, so please don't hesitate to submit them by typing them into the question and answer section as we move along. And now we'll move forward and look at the participants of the survey. The past several years have, I think to no one's surprise, have been a challenging period for compliance teams at financial firms and really continuing a state of affairs that has existed since the global financial crisis, now hard to believe fully 10 years ago. We expect that 2018 will be no different, and if anything, the pace of evolution is set to accelerate on a number of fronts. In areas like cybersecurity, individual manager accountability, and also in the ever-increasing demands that regulators have for more data on the activities of industry participants. Definitely, systemic forces are reshaping the US and UK market landscapes, and regulators are going to continue to put a high priority on stamping out market abuse and insider trading. The effects we expect will have definite implications for not only regulations, of course, but tax codes and reporting standards, and notably for enforcement activity. Non-compliance carries very significant financial and reputational risks, as I think we all know. Last year, the Deutsche Bank was fined $630 million in fines by the FCA in the UK and regulators in the US, including the SEC. Actually, most of that amount, 425 million of it, was paid to the New York State Department of Financial Services. So it can be quite a frenzy, all in response to deficient AML controls at Deutsche Bank. The SEC also brought charges against Deerfield Management for the misuse of inside information. And I think these cases really highlight the significant potential costs that are involved in failing to establish, maintain, and enforce policies and procedures that are reasonably designed to manage risk. In the long run, ultimately, firms need to implement solutions that are durable and cost-effective. And while firms are turning to technology to achieve these ends, only 2% of the firms that we surveyed report to have fully automated compliance processes. Virginie will talk a little bit more about that research in particular a bit later. Firms are definitely looking to raise their game, continuing investments in compliance, particularly in areas like surveillance technology, regulatory expertise, GRC-related technology, and sheer capacity of adding additional staff. The trends affecting regulation combined with all of these myriad solutions that firms are implementing suggest that we can certainly expect a very dynamic period of evolution in the industry moving forward. With that, I'll hand the mic over to Virginie, who will walk through the findings.
Thank you very much, Doug, and welcome to everybody on the line. As Doug mentioned, I'm going to be going over some of the main findings from the survey that we conducted. I won't be going through all of them. You can read the paper itself to go through some of the finer details too, and I'd encourage you to do so. But if we look here, I mean, the first thing I would comment is that we're constantly having to react and respond to different regulations that are happening across the globe. There's sort of an ongoing over the last 10 years, there's been massive changes across the market in many different segments and sectors. And there's also been discussion in the US about making it keeping it simple, I think, as articulated by the CFTC's Commissioner Giancarlo last year. So that could change. Obviously, some of the regulations that are in place can always be tweaked, as we have seen in Europe as well, since the regime under the European Market Infrastructure Regulation has been tweaked constantly since it's been into force. So there are a lot of things that capital markets firms have to keep a handle on, not least of which is also extraterritoriality. Regulators don't always agree with each other. Regulation certainly isn't commensurate with each other. So we have to figure in and factor in the fact that firms are going to have to remain compliant in each market. It's not like you get an operational manual with each of these regulations coming out either. So when you think about it in the context of post-crisis cost cutting, we see many firms are short-handed, especially within the operations and technology functions, and that's where cuts have hit the hardest over the years. And we've seen a lot of that happening on the sell side. The buy side, though, is quickly catching up, unfortunately. So the lack of manpower and the steady pipeline of compliance deadlines is a likely reason why only 4% of respondents on this slide feel they have an entirely strategic approach to regulatory reform. The rest of respondents are engaging in tactical approaches to some extent. There's firefighting going on. Firms at the more strategic end of the spectrum may have invested in specific technologies to support change, or they may be operating in a very limited number of markets and feel that they've got a handle on their domestic markets, so that they're safe for now, at least. The 21% of respondents who are dealing with compliance in an entirely tactical manner on the other side of the spectrum are likely to be hindered by duplicative processes, unsustainable workarounds, and if the regulator comes a-knocking, as some of them do, especially in the UK and the US, they may not stand up to close scrutiny. So obviously that's something to really worry about if you're on the left hand of the spectrum here. With that, I will check everybody's still out there. So we have our first polling question for you. So would you say over the past 12 months, which of the following types of investment has your firm made in compliance support? If you'd like to vote now. This is your primary investment, I would say. Where have you spent the most of your compliance dollars or pounds or euros? Okay. If we close that out now. Okay, that's interesting. So we have consultants are obviously benefiting very well there. So that's interesting. Obviously, there's some degree of rework going on in the market. I think the fact you don't get an operational manual is probably telling there. What do you think, Doug? There's also vendors being spent on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I would concur.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yes, and only 10% have got a centralization project or have completed one. If we turn to the next slide, you can see the same question that was posed to our 120 respondents. So it's slightly different. We see more in investments here in technology. I guess certain areas of compliance workflow have really evolved from being manually intensive or to partially or fully automated over the last few years. Firms tend to have invested where they've had regulatory changes in a particular jurisdiction, or they've had a fine in particular. And Doug touched on a few of those earlier. Over the past 12 months, you see just 45% of respondents have increased their investment in dedicated vendor tech, and only 25% have opted to build their own tools. So the reason they wouldn't build versus buying, I guess, is due to cost pressures and whether you have the in-house support and understanding of what you're trying to achieve. If you do go down the build route, firms will be, the kinds of reason they cite for that is due to esoteric requirements for operational structures, or they have particular asset classes that they feel that they would better understand to support. But there's not that many of them these days. I think if you asked this about 15 years ago, there'd be a different dynamic. But many of these executives are now looking at things like ongoing total cost of ownership of the platforms and technologies they spend on, rather than just the pure implementation cost perspective. So respondent firms have also engaged in system rework. So similarly, from everyone on the line here, consultants have helped them understand the requirements of compliance deadlines, or they may have engaged in cost reduction exercises. Only 16% of firms, compared to 10% of you guys, have engaged in the centralization process, which reflects the continued tactical approach to compliance as a function. Aite Group overall anticipates that this percentage is going to significantly change over the next few years once the dust has settled on some of the in-flight regulatory programs of work. Hopefully it will settle at some point, although many deadlines have been pushed back, unfortunately. If we turn to the next slide, where we look at next-gen technologies, there's been a lot of buzz around the topic of RegTech. Maybe not everybody understands what it means yet. I think we had a stat in the report that showed that not everybody is using it, especially on the buy side. But the regulators certainly are, not least of which is the FCA in the UK. They've been talking about RegTech for some time now. This week, in fact, they called for industry input on how to make this current system of regulatory reporting in the UK more accurate, efficient and consistent. And part of that is engaging with fintechs. They have their own regulatory sandbox, and they're also, this week again, they made another announcement with the CFTC and the innovation lab there. So across the pond, and they're holding hands and fostering greater support for fintech compliance issues, or that's so the rhetoric goes for now. So very interesting to see that that's happening within the regulatory circles as well as within the industry. Obviously, the buzz around RegTech has compelled some firms to investigate newer technologies, including data analytics tools based on NoSQL, robotic process automation or RPA, and other technologies based on artificial intelligence or machine learning. These are buzzwords that are popping up everywhere around RegTech. So firms' fear of missing out on a new technology development that their peers are deploying has contributed to this hype. We expect the application of next-gen technology is a challenge, so you must really carefully consider it. If you're going to enter into a pilot phase for anything, you need to think about the cost benefits of doing so, and whether the technology is actually suitable for the specific purpose that you're trying to achieve. As you can see on this chart, respondent views on these next-gen technologies kind of vary from what you might expect. Cloud-hosted models and services are actually at the top of the list. 80% of respondents believe their firms are likely to adopt these services in the compliance space, and 44% of them actually believe it's extremely likely. So I know cloud isn't as buzzy as it was, but it was peaking the hype cycle about a decade ago. But in the intervening time, we've seen much more implementation progress. I think a lot of the regulatory requirements around data are increasing, and analytics as well. If you think about fundamental review of the trading book and all of these things, many firms are considering the compute power requirements for data and analytics. So they may need to reduce their infrastructure costs in the longer term. They may want to look at things other than in-house deployment. And if you think about the light to no technology footprint at the firm's premises via a cloud option, that can deliver such a compelling argument for lower total cost of ownership, or TCO. Many financial regulations are actually data intensive, so not least of which is MiFID here. So that explains why a lot of data management technology is being deployed. So 80% of them there are saying that they're interested in that. 2/3 of respondents feel their firms are likely to adopt data analytics tools. Again, similar reasons behind that. The majority of respondents are less positive, or at the moment at least, about the future of newer technologies in the scene, such as AI-based tools and distributed ledger technologies. So I wonder if this will change in a year. There seems to be more hype within the asset management community now. There seems to have been, that has picked up the hype cycle there. So maybe this will change, but I'm slightly skeptical myself. If we look at the next slide around planned investment, the vast majority of respondents believe their firm will continue spending the same amount or more on technology, we can see here. And that's because obviously there's going to be more compliance deadlines coming along, but they're going to be some round fixing tactical fixes that have been put in place. There may be some strategic bent to some of the investment that's going to go on over the next year or so. So firms really have to take this exercise, take a point, and reevaluate what they're spending and where they're spending it in order to be better positioned for the future. So this whole webinar is about moving from a reactive approach to a truly proactive one. You've got to think about your expenditure. If you're just throwing bodies at the problem, that's just going to get worse year on year as more requirements come into force. So if we look at areas for improvement on the next slide, we ask the question, what would you like to improve about your compliance IT setup? In terms of where the money is best spent, reporting support's at the top of the list. I guess there's a lot of transparency requirements in the market, in all areas of the market. I would say that is definitely pushing up investment in that space. Just behind that, though, workflow support, ease of use, better support of unstructured data. They're all things that you definitely have to think about if you're going to be scrutinized for your systems and controls by the regulator, especially if they're doing on-site visits, as some of them do. The user interface and usability of these compliance technologies are likely to increase in importance over time as newer recruits will have grown up in a more digital age. You have obviously staff turnover and key person risk to think about. These newer recruits probably have different expectations for their work IT environments. So a simple and easy to use interface also means that users can be onboarded quickly, and then long-term risk is reduced from those individuals. If we turn to the next slide, we asked the question around the difficulty of each area. If you think about a high degree of regulatory uncertainty within the industry over the last 5 years, it's made it very difficult for teams to get business done and get business buy-in for compliance technology targeted spending, especially on the strategic end of things. I think because of that steady flow of requirements coming in, firms are just sort of trying to keep their head above water in dealing with these things as they come in, make sure that they meet the deadlines, or at least within good time in demonstrating best efforts in certain jurisdictions if there's some leeway by the regulator. As well as the inability to definitively schedule compliance projects. Obviously, those deadline slippage has happened, and there's been last-minute revisions. If I think about EMEA, there were several last-minute revisions. MiFID deadlines this year have slipped backwards also. FRTB slipped back by 4 years in Europe. So we have to constantly think about these. It's not set in stone, these deadlines. They're constantly moving goalposts. So firms have to think about building flexibility into their processes and technology platforms. So they need to think about any last-minute changes to requirements, deadline changes, priority changes for the business that may affect these things. So unfortunately, some of this uncertainty has meant that firms are opting to wait until the last minute to implement their changes, and that's once the regulation has gone into effect. That means that they can circumvent some of the revisions or the last-minute revisions to their systems. Unfortunately, if the regulator is keeping a close eye on you, probably not the best approach, certainly if you're a large financial institution that's coming into the radar and to the scope of systemic risk especially. So this chart is reflecting the challenge that 83% of firms cite the time to support new regulatory requirements as difficult, and a third feel it's very difficult or extremely difficult. So understandably, I think that's going to be reflected across the industry. Both buy side and sell side are being hit by these deadlines now. It's not just something that the banks have to worry about. Obviously, the pace of change is not the only pain point. Respondents also support non-standard data requirements, risk and controls, and the oversight of those, business structure issues, lack of automation overall, and client pressure as other things that they're worried about. Non-standard data, if I take that, for instance, it's a challenge for most firms because of the significant uptick in data transparency and obviously the reporting requirements that we saw on the previous slide. Data might not be easily accessed and aggregated, especially if it's kept in very siloed repositories in a non-machine readable format across financial institutions. So if you think about a lot of terms and conditions and agreements and things like that, they may be PDFs. God forbid, they may even be hard copies in filing cabinets in certain firms still. So you've got to think about that as a particular pain point. Silos at the business level and the technology architecture level are also a reason why oversight and control are challenging, and why automation can be hard to introduce across a firm if there isn't buy-in across the different business units and you don't have sort of easily connected silos. So it really can be quite painful overall. And this has a significant impact on the next slide that we're looking at. obviously, to stay ahead of the regulators, you need to think about how you monitor compliance and internal compliance amongst your staff. So there are transparency requirements stemming from multiple regulations that have further increased attention on these issues. And it's not just a case of firms meeting their regular reporting obligations, they must also deal with a whole slew of ad hoc reporting requirements. And as I mentioned, on-site visits by regulators. And if you're systemically risky or determined as such, that's even more concerning from a reputational risk standpoint. So a fully decentralized approach to compliance monitoring entails the updating of multiple systems and records. This process also tends to be reactive rather than proactive for many firms, and it means that you're reliant on things like calendar prompts to review data at a pre-established time. And if you're reviewing hard copy certification as you are here, that's slightly worrying. And if you don't have any technology, whether it's in-house built or vendor technology, that can be a very painful process indeed and involve a lot of man hours. So you also could risk financial penalties, which is a less than desirable outcome from a reputational risk standpoint, if you can't answer questions within the timeframes that the regulator dictates. So obviously, it's quite surprising that over half of respondents are monitoring compliance via hard copy certification. It's particularly inefficient because they can be harder to access and track these documents in an automated manner. It's positive, I guess, to see that some firms have deployed technology to track these policies, and some firms are using multiple methods, which I guess reflects the potentially siloed nature of those financial institutions' operations and the lack of centralization, as we saw earlier. So we're going to go to our next polling question for you. So this is another question we asked to our surveyed audience last year. So how reactive versus proactive do you feel your firm is with regard to monitoring compliance? So do you feel you're very reactive, proactive, very proactive, or you don't know? If you could vote now. Given that's the topic of the webinar, it should be an interesting finding. And hopefully everyone's had time to vote. If we can close it now. Let's see. Well, that's interesting. Okay, so we've got sort of in the middle there. Some feel that they're proactive. Others are feeling that, well, not quite the same as we had with the results of our survey, but maybe more of you are positive about being proactive in your outreach. Maybe you've recently spent on technology in that space, or you've worked with consultants to help identify your pain points that need to be tackled. Doug, is that what you expected to see?
Yeah, I think it's pretty consistent with our own read and some of the observations that we would make across the firms that we're exposed to. Sure.
If we go to the next slide, you can see what Doug's referring to there. So in spite of the many challenges that respondents are facing in the compliance IT space, over half of firms feel their firm is proactive. So there's 53% of firms that we spoke to last year said that they felt they were in a good place. So in line with some of the people on the phone, obviously, and listening in. Obviously, only 4% said they were very proactive in monitoring non-compliance. So I guess that's they felt they were in the best place possible for the future. This perception could be because these firms have invested in technology, or because they currently feel that it's an area of it's not a significantly challenging area at the moment for whatever reason. Unfortunately, if you look at the reactive side, the 47% of respondents who feel they're reactive, it can mean that they're unlikely to monitor problems until a reputational impacting event, such as a fine from a regulator, occurs, or other things in the market that they can't respond to occur, which is particularly worrying. So proper evaluation of how and why compliance issues occur and how much they cost for firms in terms of resources, direct costs like fines, and in terms of opportunity, if you can quantify that, which is quite challenging. But it's a good thing to do to prohibit firms from duplicating errors that they may have made. So if you want to be on the very right end of the slide to be very proactive, I guess the evaluation process, the metrics being fed back into a formalized and routine review for which the business and compliance teams work together to learn from failures and resolve them is really, really important. So that's how you get to be on the right hand of this slide, I believe. And we have another polling question just now. So this is our third and final polling question for you. How far do you feel your organization has moved away from manual processes for compliance support? So are you fully automated, somewhat manual, or fully manual? This could correlate, I guess, with how proactive or reactive you feel that your firm is also. Give you some time to vote there. And tell the truth. I find sometimes feel like some people may feel that the regulators are listening in. I hope they're not. They can't identify you if they are. Okay, if we can close that out, see what people responded. Okay, interesting. So no one is fully automated, but we do have some fully manual firms out there. So they definitely are going to be much more on the reactive side of things. And the rest seem to be in the middle. So interesting. Okay. I think that tells us a lot. When it came to the respondents to our survey, it was about the same. I think a lot of firms feel that they're having to deal with manual processes, and that could be why they have high headcounts within the compliance departments, that they feel are unsustainable in the long term. So certainly that's something that you can't keep throwing bodies at. So certainly strategic review of compliance needs to come at some point when you can get up for air from all of the compliance deadlines coming in. So this slide shows how some of the firms feel in terms of being positioned for future compliance requirements. Obviously, you never really stop. There's never really a big pause in terms of deadlines across the globe if you're operating in many markets, or multiple markets and jurisdictions. So the majority of firms also see some room for improvement in the positioning of their current IT setup to meet their ongoing compliance challenges. And 4% unfortunately feel that they're not at all well positioned, and they have a lot of catching up to do for the rest of the market. So I'm guessing if you're fully manual, as some of you are out there, then that's probably going to be you. This reflects obviously the other responses that we had that indicate challenges such as the need for better workflow, for regulatory monitoring and cybersecurity issues that have come up during the survey. So if I think about some of the key takeaways we had as we looked over some of the results, firms definitely need to better understand their compliance issues and track costs and other impacts if they can. Obviously, having consistent metrics and being able to feed them back to your management team, to your compliance team, keeps you better positioned for the future and improving on a cycle of constant improvement rather than reactive to the regulatory developments and the regulators if they come calling. Firms should also consider next-gen technologies where they're appropriate and only where they're appropriate. Obviously, if you're going to pilot something like natural language processing for trade surveillance and e-communications monitoring, both areas that we've covered at Aite Group, they could prove extremely useful when looking at tone or context of conversations that could be overlooked by pure keyword-based alert systems. But you have to consider whether you have enough of an issue to be able to engage in those pilots, because they obviously consume resources, they take time. These are things that you have to balance in the cost-benefit analysis. So we imagine that there's going to be a lot of trialing and piloting in that particular area going forward in this year, and some of the buzz around AI and RegTech will be around that. We also expect that there's going to be much more discussion about cloud-based options in light of some of the incoming data-intensive regulations and those already in place. MiFID, obviously, with its many, many pages, has a lot of different transparency requirements in it, for example. Lower total cost of ownership and SaaS-based models will stand compliance teams in good stead to focus on the core functions rather than dealing with technology upgrades or maintenance issues. That's another thing that we had some consistent feedback on those that have moved to cloud. And documentation centralization can also help teams get a better handle on non-compliance. So the benefit of a central platform is to enable compliance teams, multiple other functions, and the C-suite to have one single point of reference to monitor employee compliance, rather than having to spend time locating documentation. So if you think about regulatory developments such as the senior managers and certification regime in the UK, which is due to be applied to asset managers early next year, and the manager in charge regime in Hong Kong, both of those will compel firms to focus more on the centralization of this data in the future, because you really want to keep out of especially if you're, as an individual, you're being targeted by a regulator, not just your firm. You really have to keep a handle on these things. It could be reputational risk for the individuals rather than the firm, or both. So another area where we saw some key takeaways is real-time support is important, especially for latency-sensitive areas in the front office. So there are many batch-based systems, there are many manual processes. If you think about real-time reactivity and proactivity, you need to be out there thinking about which processes need to be improved. And with that, from my key takeaways, I'll pass it back to Doug.
Thank you, Virginie. It's certainly definitely not an easy task at all, I guess, but the merits of adopting a strategic approach to regulatory compliance are certainly very difficult to argue against. Ideally, firms would act based on a degree of foresight and examine how the regulatory duties that they're carrying out across the jurisdictions in which they're operating and how they are managed, and envision solutions that fit into a well-designed compliance framework. Doing this starts to stray into operational risk and operational priorities, and I think will ultimately involve sometimes eliminating duplicative work streams. I think that was mentioned before, as well as making lasting changes to operations that are modeled on best practices. All of which are in addition to some of the core compliance objectives around implementing technologies at an enterprise level. So it's definitely no easy task. How can a firm get on a front foot and implement the right strategic solutions to compliance? Obviously the answers will vary based on the specific situation of the firm and the jurisdictions in which they're operating. But the key factors of success really come down to people, process, and technology. On the people side, it's essential to look throughout your firm as a whole and develop a holistic culture of compliance. This is growing more critical as regulators increase their focus on individual manager accountability, like the senior managers regime that Virginie just referenced. Setting the right tone at the top and reinforcing that through required training can really build the right expectations from the front to the back office and to senior management. Personally, I think that maintaining a corporate dialogue about compliance can make culture one of the firm's most valuable assets in managing regulatory risk. In terms of process, as the research suggests and as confirmed by the poll, working reactively means that many firms are still maintaining processes that they would consider to be outdated. It's important to note that adapting to regulatory requirements brings with it an opportunity to revisit those processes and reduce operational risk, which can improve long-term competitive advantage. Taking a strategic approach to managing regulatory risk can at the same time involve re-engineering business processes, introducing new policies to improve operating practices, in addition to the programs that you would want to implement related to education, training, and ongoing compliance monitoring. And finally, technology. We've heard a lot about RegTech today. RegTech solutions certainly carry a lot of promise, and they can address a wide range of challenges. Some of the most pressing workflow requirements include cybersecurity, employee-level surveillance, AML and KYC obligations, regulatory alerts, as well as issue tracking and case management. Firms must also consider the use of technology for the functions comprising the core of their compliance program. Things like policy management, centralization of document management, as Virginie mentioned, attestations and reporting. I expect that as RegTech evolves, the ability to deploy solutions that address very specific regulatory needs, but fit into an integrated and tech-enabled framework overall can only increase. And with that, we'd now like to open it up for some questions. Again, if you have any, please do type them into the question and answer session. The first question that we have, and Virginia, this is one for you, is how are regulators responding to these changes, and including regulators in other jurisdictions? Obviously, we've talked a lot on this webinar about how firms are responding, but clearly the regulators aren't standing still themselves.
Sure. I mean, I think it's very interesting to look at the regulator interaction with the fintech universe and the sort of the innovation labs that have been set up by some of the key regulators there, or it's regulatory sandboxes as they are. And it has been some of the, not all of the regulators have obviously gone down that route. We've seen the UK FCA, the CFTC in the US. We've seen the Monetary Authority of Singapore also setting up a lab and been talking about it. In Canada, we've seen some of the regulators there taking action in Ontario, the Ontario regulator based out of Toronto. So certainly I think there is a lot of interest and dialogue that's going on between the regulators and what's going on within the realm of RegTech, as it were. I heard, I read the Bank for International Settlements paper this week that was came up with a new buzzword, which is subtech, which is about supervisory technology. So if they're coming up with their own categories of buzzword, then you know they really are beginning to get engaged in the discussions around this topic. And I find that other regulators are keeping a close eye on what's going on. They may not be as proactive as some of these at the forefront of change, but certainly they want to keep a handle on how to regulate in a better manner, how to be more engaged with the industry. And I think that RegTech is a key part of that, and most of them do recognize it.
I think personally, I can only deal with one tech term at a time, and RegTech is still in its early stages, so I won't move off of that one quite yet. Our second question, Virginia, also kind of relates to something that you were touching on, and that is around the use of next-gen technologies. What are the next-gen technologies making an impact for RegTech overall?
As I mentioned earlier, I think we're really seeing more of the sort of AI, machine learning technology being deployed within the realm of market surveillance. And one of my analysts on my team, Danielle Tierney, actually looks at that particular topic in detail. There's been a lot of developments. There are a lot of different vendors that are trialing technologies in that space. It's particularly interesting because obviously a lot of things that are going on that you're having to track for market abuse purposes are not the most obvious. You know, there's a lot of code words being used. There's a lot of things that are hard to correlate with each other. So you really need something to help you identify those signals in a lot of information that may be coming out from the front office, or any recordings that you may have. Tone and a voice may even indicate many different things. So certainly we're seeing a lot of deployments of AI tools around that particular topic. We're seeing some interesting developments in regulatory change management, as I mentioned, with that constant pipeline of regulation coming in. Firms are having to try and interpret things in a very quick manner, especially when you see the ESMA's workload for the year. I mean, there were pages and pages and pages published in January of what they're planning to put out this year in terms of consultations. Obviously, it's hard for teams to wade through those. That's why they engage consultants often to help them with that, as well as legal teams. But certainly having some degree of understanding of how to manage that pipeline and maybe using technology within that realm is something that there's been a lot of discussion about. Whether it works or not is another matter, but I do see a lot of interest in that topic.
Okay, our next question is actually related to Cordium, and Virginia, I think it would be unfair for me to pass it to you. So the question is, what is Cordium doing to address this? Kind of a broad question, and but I think an appropriate one, because there are a broad set of challenges. I think at a high level, you know, we're looking to blend our capabilities as a firm. Our capabilities include regulatory expertise and technology in order to produce solutions for our clients. Increasingly, we're building our knowledge, you know, our IP, which really consists of our knowledge of regulatory requirements and how they can be managed in a practical way across the firms and the industries that we serve. How do we build that IP into software? The idea is to provide a platform that allows clients to manage regulatory compliance in a consistent and controlled manner across the enterprise, some of that centralization and overall monitoring and bringing things together in a more, seamless and transparent manner. But also integrating that platform with solutions that themselves meet very specific requirements in areas like cybersecurity, marketing material reviews, even vendor risk management as well. And we can evolve those solutions over time and even add new solutions as the market changes and as the needs of our clients evolve. Our platform, Cordium's platform for this, is Pilot, and we are on the cusp of sharing a lot more information about Pilot with you in the months to come. It's something that we've been investing in and developing and are very excited about in terms of what its potential could be. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and that question is also kind of related to one of the technology topics that you mentioned, Virginie, and why is cloud such a big topic now?
I mean, the concerns about cloud haven't gone away. Let me put it that way. There are certainly still issues, especially when you think about incoming regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation in the European jurisdiction. I think there are a lot of worries about data control, cybersecurity. As you mentioned, there's some, the SEC this week came out with new proposals for disclosure around cybersecurity breaches. Obviously, they were attacked by a hacker not so long ago, a couple of years ago, that they just disclosed last year. So there are certainly worries about data storage, data security out there. But whether you are fully secure on your on-premise solutions versus the cloud is also another thing to bear in mind when we've spoken to financial institutions on the topic. Certainly, I think the long-term trend is towards cloud because of the total cost of ownership issue, the fact you have some degree of elasticity in terms of usage, so you can spin up and spin down as required rather than having to add machines and having to have sort of keeping the lights on costs for hardware as particularly onerous and painful. So we are seeing a lot of investigation and evaluation of private cloud options, as well as some degree, but not very public, of public cloud adoption for certain things.
Very good. I think we'll leave it there, and in the interest of time, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Just as it's essential for you to continue the collaboration within your firms, it's definitely vital for us to connect with you as well and to facilitate the flow of information and insights across our network. In the coming months, you can expect to see Cordium engaging with your firm and the market as a whole in new and different ways. Please look forward to our follow-up summary email and recording of today's webinar. If you haven't done so already, you can download the white paper on this topic. I very much look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks for your time and have a good day.